hours, so it's good to be, focus decisions with workers to have. But because it's almost easy, the factory's open, so that the workers at the factory, it's gonna be running tomorrow. So we had to postpone them, which I'm sad, which means I'll miss them, unfortunately. But, so since it's a Friday, just gonna.
How are you implementing projects to which organization?
So working with, VIP, and then also this, the FGDs tomorrow, where, okay. Yeah, and so one of the projects. Okay. This.
The pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker for a couple of different reasons. I've known Laura actually now for a while. She has been working in Bangladesh and on Bangladesh. It's been actually for quite, how long has it been? About 10 years now? 11 years. So she is currently an associate professor at the Columbia Business School. But this academic year, she's visiting Princeton, which is coming to an end, I believe. Her PhD from Clay House Business School. As a matter of fact, PhD thesis, she actually worked on Bangladesh, worked in Bangladesh on RMG sector, especially focusing on the occupational safety and safety and hazard, OSH, yes, those committees. So it was, I think, our research looked at a time when RMG sector was going through as an aftermath of Rana Plaza, and kind of trying to understand how to adopt better practices, especially in an area which we usually don't relate to productivity, but our research really looked at the complementary between managerial quality and adoption of this kind of organization, and without any kind of trade-off or sacrifice on, say, productivity, which firms, there's a perception that there's a cost to adopting this kind of good practices. So this is I think, very, very, very interesting. And she has not forgotten Bangladesh, has been coming back repeatedly. And there are a lot of junior researchers here. I think this is one thing I would highlight of kind of focusing on having an area where one can and should build a whole portfolio on. So I think this kind of research or this kind of focus is very important for especially for early career researchers, but she's definitely not an early career researcher anymore. But I'm really glad to see that based on those kind of work, it has flourished into many different kind of things. And as a matter of fact, very much related to what she's going to present today. I should also mention again, personally for me, it's very exciting for a couple of different reasons. One reason, her work overlaps with some of the work I have done in this area, trying to understand in market failure, but in a very kind of intra-farm sense. So some of her work actually overlaps with organ science. I think it goes a little beyond how economists think about inside farm capabilities and relational capital, things like that. Laura and I share some of the co-authors that we have worked together. Rocco comes to my mind. We also share responsibility with Mushfiq being lead academic of IGC. I should mention that. So Laura, it's a pleasure having you here. And we're looking forward to your work that is actually very, very new. And please feel free to ask questions. So since we're missing few people today who I would like to see today, but it's okay. If you have any question during her talk, please feel free to raise. I think I would expect mostly clarificatory question in nature, and I can be judge of that. But I'll actually request Laura to kind of manage time. We have until maybe like an hour and 10 minutes or so. If you have like a specific like suggestion which it goes beyond clarification, feel free to raise kind of save it for the last, however you want to do it. But obviously, if you run out of time, then you will not have time to actually ask that question. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there. Unfortunately, Professor Inam is still here, but he has to stay. Would you like to share at least some thoughts before you leave? The broader is R&D sector and regional capital, but if you can.
No, I think this is, I would have liked to listen to this seminar, but unfortunately I will be going. But I think for all of our researchers, the important part is to see how things are placed, what are the research ideas, and you can actually create your own ideas out of to look for. I'm looking forward for that. I think a good research always have a very good methodology. So I think you should understand how she has done it. And I think that will be part of our learning. And I know Laura would be learning something probably or not. But I think our objective is to exchange these learning experience from each other. Thank you.
So with that very nice word, Laura.
Amazing. Thank you so much for inviting me here to share this research. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and to your comments on the project. It's a very new project, so I apologize that your handout is slides and not a paper. We're very close, but we're not quite there on the paper. And I'm presenting a slightly shorter version of the presentation to leave time for discussion at the end and questions, and happy to take questions as they go. I guess, yeah, you all, okay, so then people can see, great. So I'm presenting with Shakil Ahmed, who's at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, and Rachel Heath, who's at the University of Washington. And yeah. Full screen. There we go. And then okay, I think we're in good shape. So the motivation for the research is that, as I'm sure I don't need to tell this room, the emergence of low-skill industrial sectors in lower-income countries has provided important economic benefits to workers, especially to women. At the same time, these jobs are characterized by having low wages and often kind of poor quality amenities, things like very long working hours, for example. And there's emerging evidence from different kind of lower income country settings that monopsony power may be prevalent in labor markets and industrial sectors. And by monopsony power, what we mean is that a firm has the ability to mark down compensation to workers below the competitive wage level. So in a competitive labor market, the firm will be paying the worker the equivalent of the marginal revenue product of their labor for the firm. And be the kind of the law of one price will prevail for a certain type of labor in the market. In a market where employers have some monopsony power, they're paying below that marginal revenue product of labor. And typically what they're paying is somewhere between that kind of competitive wage and the worker's outside options. So what they could earn in their best alternative employment outside that market. And so the idea is that the firm is able to kind of extract some rents from the worker in the employment relationship. And so this is what I mean when we talk about monopsony, this possibility of firms paying or compensating workers below their marginal product, revenue product of labor. So kind of with this backdrop, we also know, I should say, that workers lack access to centralized information sources about employers and job vacancies, and they face high search costs, right? So especially in very dense kind of urban labor markets, like in and around Dhaka, for example, it's kind of costly to move around. It takes a while to get places, and maybe you have to pay for transport. And so looking for jobs, if you're looking kind of physically through space, can be expensive. And there's no kind of centralized job boards where people can go to find out about who's hiring or to learn about the amenities or the kind of wages paid by employers. And so this led us to hypothesize that workers may have limited and incorrect information about difficult to observe dimensions of pay and amenities, which may be a source of monopsony power for firms. And I'll go through our conceptual framework for why we think that's the case in just one slide. And so in this research, what we do, first we establish whether industrial workers in a developing country, specifically garment workers in Bangladesh, are aware of and have accurate beliefs about local wages and amenities in their local labor markets. Then to preview it, we're going to find that they do not. And so given that we find this, we conducted a field experiment to test implications for their actual mobility, wages, and amenities. Okay. So the research questions that we ask, first, how aware are workers of local employers? Do they have accurate beliefs about the wage and amenity distributions in their local labor market? And second, does providing workers with information about local employers' wages and amenities affects their beliefs about what they could, about the wages and amenities in their local labor market and their employment outcomes? And if they do, then how? So I'll tell you a little bit more about the actual field experiment that we ran, but first to kind of situate the research in a conceptual framework. This is kind of just saying it in words here. So we start from the starting point that workers face high search costs and they have limited information about the employers in the local labor market and the wages and amenities they offer. Given the information they have, they form biased beliefs about their outside options. And by outside option, we mean if you think about kind of a worker who's currently working in the firm, in a given firm, what's the best kind of wage and amenity package they could get if they were to take a job at a different firm? Okay. Now, with incomplete information, workers may anchor their beliefs about what they could earn in the labor market on their current job. So this is a pattern of anchoring that has been found in this Jaeger et al. Paper in the German labor market, where essentially you can think of people perceive the wage they could earn in the market as a kind of an average of, or a weighted average of their current wage at their current employer, and the best wage they could earn at an alternative firm. And so they're kind of putting some weight for this kind of behavioral reasons, because they have these kind of limited information. They put weight on the employer's wage as opposed to just only kind of considering the actual true wage that is available in the market. And so in this, with this pattern of misperceived beliefs, workers who are in low wage or low amenity firms may be too pessimistic about what they could earn if they were to search for a job, because they perceive the wage will be closer to their current wage. And if they're in a low wage firm, that means they're kind of perceiving that the wage is actually lower than what they could truly earn were they to search and find a job. Okay. Now, in this kind of world of this, if this is how workers form their beliefs, then these types of biased beliefs reduce search and mobility. So workers may not search for alternative jobs, even when better jobs exist nearby, because they perceive the jobs to be not as good as they actually are. And so given that they face search costs, they may perceive that it's not worth their while to actually search. They may also actually, if they do search, they may search inefficiently, because it may be hard for them to figure out which are the firms that have the better wages and amenities. Okay. Now, this reduced mobility is what gives employers market power. So employers face less elastic labor supply. If they say were to cut wages, workers kind of would not be as responsive to that as would be predicted in a competitive market, because they have this misperception of what they could earn. And this is the mechanism that enables markdowns in job quality. So we think in this project as a job as a bundle of wages, which we think is what workers care the most about, but also these kind of non-wage amenities. So things like, does the firm pay their wages on time? Do they, kind of pay for the overtime hours? Do they kind of ask workers to work fair overtime hours? Do they respectfully interact with workers, or at least not kind of harass them in other ways? All of these kind of dimensions of not quite pay, but kind of the everything else that the firm provides. Okay.
Laura, one quick question. So one question is about not knowing if there's a good job out there. The other thing is, what's the likelihood of me getting a better job at a better firm?
Yeah.
So do you have any evidence of finding whether people actually discount further by the difficulty of getting that job? And does that fit into not even exploring? Because I know what's the point.
So we're actually in the field experiment. So we will kind of have some interesting evidence on this that, really specific information about what people could actually, like jobs people could actually get, is the most useful information, which may not sound surprising, but if you just tell people about the firms and what wages and amenities they offer locally, that may not be enough, because maybe workers outside option is not actually well represented by that entire firm distribution. Maybe it's much more specific. So we're going to kind of see that empirically. In this framework, the outside option would be kind of the job that the worker could get. So it's kind of like it's like the option that I could change to this job. Almost you can think of it as like the offer has already arrived. Almost that would kind of be the way it shows up in the model.
So, and you did it in two parts, and which I want to highlight, because you had this, before even the RCT, you collected a lot of data. So if my hunch is correct, one way to correct is higher grade workers will know more about the good jobs than if I'm in a lower grade worker. I don't really care because I have to compete with 10,000 other people. So it's not worth even gathering that information. So I should see a gradient of knowledge.
We do see that, and I'll kind of Sure, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but and it is the case that workers with more experience have slightly more accurate beliefs. That's like true. But there's still a big misperception gap, even among workers with many years of experience or several years of experience. But they certainly have better, like more accurate beliefs than people with less experience. Okay, yeah, so in this conceptual framework, the mechanism that generates the ability for employers to mark down wages is the fact that because workers don't have good information about what wages and amenities they could obtain in the local labor market, they're not as mobile as they otherwise would be. And so that means that they're less elastic, their labor supply is less elastic to their employer. Okay, so this narrates, so as I mentioned, we are going to end up, we do, as Antanu referenced, we do a kind of a big data collection at the beginning to actually measure what workers perceive about wages and amenities in their local labor markets, and we see that workers have very biased beliefs. And this motivated us to run a field experiment, in other words, a randomized control trial. We're going to randomly assign garment workers to two different types of interventions. So one is what we call the vacancies intervention. So in this intervention, we worked with the Center for Entrepreneurship Development at Brock University, and we ran a large-scale, almost every month survey of HR managers in garment factories. And we sourced from them every month very detailed information about their vacancies in that month. And then you can think of it as we compiled a booklet, and we gave that booklet based on a worker's neighborhood, kind of where they live. We told them about all of the jobs within 5 kilometers of their home in that month. And so we hypothesized that that would reduce workers' search costs, because we're saying, here's all the firms that are hiring, and here's what they're paying for all of these different jobs. And it also improves information about their outside options, because they're learning about the other firms in the market, and they're learning about the wages and some information about amenities provided by these firms. Yeah.
So while you were collecting the data regarding the vacancies, so can you please give an idea what kind of firms you collect the information for? I mean, is it like only RMG or low skilled, unskilled, or semi-skilled kind of firms?
Yeah, I will show you in detail. So the CED, the Center for Entrepreneurship Development, had done a census outside of the EPZs of all garment firms with more than 25 employees. And so these are like, they're not accessories firms, they're like all garments are very garments related firms. But then we're covering, I'll show you how we did this, but we cover a lot. I think we have about 1,800 factories in the data. So really kind of, and Savoir, Gazipur, they're all in there. So then the second intervention, we aim to improve information about the wage and amenity distribution at the firm level, so firm-specific wage and amenity information, by providing a scorecard. It almost looked like a report card of the wages and amenities available in the local labor market. And we gave this about specific employers. And then we did, in the randomized control trial, we also had a treatment arm where we gave people both the vacancies information and the scorecard information. And we did this because we thought it might relax both the information friction about which employers have better wages and amenities, and the search cost of needing to acquire that information. And so our predictions in the experiment were that these interventions should lead workers to have more accurate beliefs about the local wage distribution and the local amenity distribution. They should search more for jobs, and they should switch more if they're kind of overly pessimistic based on the first part of the framework. And then if we see that they're searching and switching more for jobs, we should see that this leads to higher wages and or amenities, so better job quality, because they would have been foregoing search that could lead them to find better quality jobs that they're now not.
Can you elaborate more on scorecard intervention?
Yeah, I will show you all this in detail. So at the beginning of the project, we kind of did a large scale survey with garment workers where we surveyed almost 9,000 garment workers in these areas. And then we had them tell us their pay and then a whole list of amenities that the garment factories may provide. And then we used that to create firm level wage and amenity scores for each factory in their neighborhood. So like ABC Garments has a score of maybe 100 out of 100 on wages and a score of 87 out of 100 on amenities. And ABC Garments is 2 kilometers from the neighborhood you live in. That's the type of information we were giving them. And we did that for every firm that we could get the information for within 5 kilometers of their home. I'll show you actually like the physical scorecard. Okay, so that's the framework and that's the experimental interventions that we ran. I do want to mention, so we're still work in progress here. We're still working through this. We see really nice updating of beliefs on wages and amenities separately in vacancies and scorecard arm, but in the both arm, where we gave them both, we think that we just kind of overloaded people with information because we showed up at their houses with these big booklets of vacancies and these really long scorecards, and then the enumerators had to explain them exactly what they were. And we don't see any updating of beliefs in this both arm. And there's very kind of mixed results. So we're still working on the data. We think that there was a kind of an information overload story here, which we're not the first. It actually turns out this happens not that infrequently in information experiments. So this was a lesson learned in this project. But I'm just mentioning this because I'm going to focus today on the vacancies and the scorecards separately. And then when we write our paper, of course, we'll report the results for this both arm. But just for parsimony, I'm going to just emphasize the first two. Okay. So I don't think I need to tell you all this. I'm probably pretty familiar with garments at this point. Of course, we know it's macroeconomically a central sector in Bangladesh. It's over 80% of exports, 13% of GDP, almost 8% of employment. It interestingly consistently ranks among the lowest or the lowest average manufacturing wages among major exporters. And it has a poor record in terms of labor rights and safety, although better in recent years. In terms of industrial work, we see in our sample that workers rarely transition from garments to other industrial sectors. If they make a transition, it's primarily to agriculture for men, and to self-employed non-agricultural work, so kind of like subsistence entrepreneurship, mostly for men, and then the women tend to transition to being a homemaker. There's very little movement into other industrial sectors, which is to say there's very limited alternative wage employment in firms. And so these garment jobs are probably these workers' best options relative to working in agriculture or self-employment. So kind of when you think of the employer's ability to mark down a wage, the wage that a garment worker could earn outside of this sector is very likely much lower. Limited collective bargaining, and then the minimum wage is adjusted every 5 years. And we started this project in the summer of 2023. So there was a minimum wage adjustment in November 2023. You may remember there was a lot of industrial unrest around that adjustment. These are the areas. So we're going to do the study in Savar, in Gazipur. This is mapping the garment factories, and where there's more factories, it's kind of the heat map. And then during COVID, we did a phone-based survey of workers, and this is showing kind of the local landmarks that workers named where they were living. And so you can see from this map that garment workers live very much where the garment factories are located. It's not so much the case that they commute from outside of these areas to go to work. And so that's going to motivate our sampling strategy on the worker side. And then you may also be familiar with this, but these factories are large. So there's in our sample or in our data, a mean employment of about 100 workers and the median is about 375. On the employer side, we see that, so how to kind of, oh yeah.
Can you go back to the, so how to interpret each dot? It's like factory reporting where their workers are coming from?
No, see, these are like in ours, so during COVID, we ran a phone-based panel survey of garment workers.
Wow.
Where we took like prior samples of seeds and then we did snowball sampling to collect more workers. And because we were doing a phone-based survey, we asked them for a landmark and a kind of location. And so we're just plotting the size of the circle is the number of workers in our sample. So it's just kind of a measure of density. And so I guess all the main point I want to make here is that almost all of this blue circles where the workers are exactly where the factories are. They're kind of like very much in the same geographic zones. Yeah.
And how many people did you survey for this?
We surveyed, I'll show those statistics, almost 9,000. Yeah. So on the firm side, we wanted to understand the nature of demand in the kind of in these local labor markets. But I'll tell you more about our firm side sample, but just to mention a couple of motivating facts. Workers primarily get jobs through their networks. So 50% of workers got their first job through a referral. And if it's not through their networks, they typically go kind of factory to factory, just searching almost randomly. And that was about 45% of workers. Managers, when we ask them their top HR challenges, they report that finding workers with the right skills and finding workers in general are far and away their top HR challenges. Even much more than absenteeism or turnover. But even though they kind of have this very high expressed need for labor, when we ask them about their advertising of vacancies, almost none of the factories do any advertising beyond the factory gate. So most of them ask their workers to reach out to family and friends. And then if they do any advertising, it's usually posting banners or notices. The only kind of, active advertising that about 20% of factories report is announcing vacancies over a loudspeaker, using a PA in the local area. And then this is a setting where we can think of turnover is very high. So there's a lot of churn in the workers, but it's very variable across factories too. So there's a lot of dispersion and turnover. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You have mentioned here that HR has some challenge regarding finding workers, but you have talked about monopsony power, right? So isn't it a bit paradoxical?
Yeah, so this is actually like this fact is exactly what a monopsonist would say. They would say, I have a very high need for labor, I have labor scarcity. And the reason they would be saying that is because no one wants to work kind of at the prevailing wage. So in the walls of monopsony firms would potentially perceive labor scarcity. So this kind of fact is actually, but then they wouldn't really be actively like spending money to search for workers because of the markdown they are benefiting from.
Can we not also hypothesize that localized workers can also have some sort of power, market power, that they can also bargain with the firm that, okay, we are going to work at a certain price, certain wage.
So, I mean, typically we think of unions as acting as the kind of, monopolists in the selling, right, as a kind of being on the selling side on labor supply. And so I think it's, possible that workers could bargain with the firms, but we also know in this setting, there's very little organized kind of labor on the worker side. And so their bargaining power is very, very is low relative to the firm. I think the primary way, so I let me see if I have this here. No, I don't think I have it. The minimum wage that firms are paying, like for a helper in 2023, just before the minimum wage adjustment, was still the minimum wage that was set in 2018 for that position, which I think was 8,000 taka at the time. So even though between 2018 and 2023, there was significant inflation in Bangladesh and the value of the real wage fell quite a bit, that was still for 50% of firms, that was exactly the wage that they paid. Interestingly, in our data, about 25% of firms pay below the minimum wage, and about 25% of firms pay above it. So like while there's still kind of a lot of, I would say, focus on the minimum wage in terms of the base wage that workers earn, there's still quite a bit of dispersion in the data as well. But that's also kind of the fact that like the real wage hasn't adjusted, like, and they're still kind of paying the nominal minimum wage from 5 years earlier is also, I mean, it's just kind of consistent with this story of firms kind of setting wages, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so how do we actually do a study? It was a big team effort between the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, which conducted all the activities with workers. And then I already mentioned the Center for Entrepreneurship Development, their Mapped in Bangladesh initiative, implemented activities with employers. And before we started the study, we did about a year of focus groups and piloting. We began, so in this timeline, I've colored the activities with the HR managers in blue or purple, and the activities with workers in orange. And in both cases, so we did a baseline in-person survey, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the samples in a couple of slides, starting in July 2023. And then for the managers, so the purples, what we did was every time before we surveyed workers, we would run the survey with the HR managers and collect their vacancies. So basically what we would do from then is, every month we collect vacancies from managers, or in the months where these blue lines are, and then we would go back and feed the information to workers and then survey workers as well. So we started the intervention, the field experiment with workers in September 2023. We gave the first vacancy and scorecard pamphlets, and then we refreshed the information every month for a few months. And then after that, we periodically refreshed it. And we followed workers for about 18 to 19 months, depending on the survey, kind of timing. So that brought us from July 2023 to January 2025. The garment factory side, we started with the Mapped in Bangladesh list, compiled by the Center for Entrepreneurship Development, which was based on a census they conducted in 2018 to 21. They listed almost 2,800 factories in our study areas of Savar, Gazipur, and Narayanganj. In 2023, we went back and we visited manufacturers with more than 25 workers, which was about 2,500. We found that 68% of those that were there in 2018 to 21 were still operational. And among those that were operational, 90% agreed to participate in our study. We wanted to understand kind of the entry dynamics. And so we randomly sampled 18 police districts and conducted censuses of new entrants in these areas. We found 291, and we had a very high response rate, 98% among the open factories. And the kind of the profiles of the new factories and the incumbent, the kind of ones that were there in 2018 to 21, are actually quite similar. So we just pull them together in all of the analysis. On the worker side, sampling was a little bit less straightforward. So what we did was take like maps in ArcGIS of the study areas, and then we put kind of circles over these industrial areas on the map that were 0.5 kilometer radius that we referred to as neighborhoods. We made sure to avoid the rivers and the marshy areas and places where no one was living, but we essentially tried to cover these industrial kind of clusters outside of Dhaka. Then when we actually went to the survey, we sampled about 9,000 workers from these circles. We had an eligibility for that. That was because we wanted to get a representative view of wages and amenities in the sector. For the experiment, in order to be eligible, we put an eligibility criterion of having less than 4.5 years of experience, which related to Antono's question earlier, was because we expected that workers that were in the sector for a long time would have acquired more information over the course of their career, which was something we had seen in a prior study that we ran. And we focused for the experiment on neighborhoods. We maintained a 1 kilometer buffer. So in our experiment, the unit of randomization is going to be the neighborhood, because we were worried that we didn't just want to randomize workers at the worker level, because 2 workers living nearby to each other, one's in the control and one's in treatment, and we give the treatment worker a bunch of information, they might just share it with the control worker. So that's why we did this neighborhood level randomization. And then we left a 1 kilometer buffer between the different experimental neighborhoods. And we did the recruitment of our experimental sample in 2 waves. In wave 1, we had a per factory cap of 8 workers to make sure we could cover all the factories for these scorecards that we wanted to make. And then in wave 2, which we recruited just about 1,600 workers, we relaxed this cap to 50. Excuse me.
So Laura, one quick question. So those neighborhoods will vary by the market thickness, right? Number of
Yes.
factories.
Yeah, and initially we thought that was going to be a major dimension of heterogeneity. This is dangerous, but I'm just going to see if I can show you one of the neighborhood maps. I don't have it in here. Okay, sorry. But we actually don't find so far strong evidence of heterogeneity based on market thickness. So market thickness meaning just like how many other employers are there for me to learn about. And this matters in areas where there's not so there's maybe some employers so that I can actually move, but not so many that I kind of just have this multitude of options and maybe the market's more competitive. But yeah, we don't see evidence, but I'm going to show you information is very localized, which may not be that surprising to Bangladeshis, because we'll get to the results. Yeah. Okay. So we want to tell workers about the wages and amenities that factories provide. So we need to measure wages and amenities at these factories. So the way that we do this is we collected wages from workers in June 2023, and we run a cross-sectional wage regression of their average hourly wage on individual worker controls and a factory fixed effect. And so the factory fixed effect is kind of allowing us to extract that factory-specific component of pay that's not based on an individual worker's kind of characteristics. To give you a sense of the across-factory variation, so labor economists typically can characterize variation in pay using the standard deviation of the factory fixed effect and log points. In our setting and here in Bangladesh, this standard deviation is about 15 log points. So kind of standard deviation away is about a 15 almost percentage point, more than that because of the conversion from logs. Difference in pay. So it's a really large kind of, there's a lot of variation. This is what this is saying across factories and pay. This is comparable to the across firm variation in pay in the entire US. So kind of across industry, across firm, across state. And this is just looking at one industry kind of in the regional area of Bangladesh. So that is a lot. On the amenity side, we had done a lot of pilot testing to figure out what amenities workers cared about. We came up with, training 6 families, including things like training, opportunities for advancement, relationship with management or kind of respectful treatment by management, safety and health, maternity benefits, kind of employer integrity in the employment relationship. And I always forget the final one. There's always one that I miss, but I'll have to come back to you on that. And then so we take these 6 families of amenities, and in order to kind of come up with an overall amenity score, we also ask workers job satisfaction and their satisfaction with pay. And so we kind of condition on the satisfaction that they have from wages. And then we ask about their satisfaction with each one of these amenities, and we weigh it by the partial correlation of reported satisfaction with a given kind of type of amenity with overall satisfaction. And so that's kind of just saying we weight these amenity families based on how much workers kind of tell us in the data they care about that dimension for their job satisfaction. And to give you a sense of the amount of cross-factory variation, so we asked about experience of harassment. And you can think about the neighborhood level, the mean P90 to P10 gap, meaning the factory at the 90th versus the 10th percentile in the neighborhood is, 48% of workers at the factory saying they've ever experienced harassment at that job versus 27% of workers saying that they've ever experienced harassment. So that's a kind of a big gap. And if you look at the P75 to P25 gap, it's still 43% compared to 32. So big gaps in terms of probability of experiencing this type of adverse event at work. So then we have our wage score, we have our amenity score, and we look first and to ask, so if we think that labor markets are competitive and we see variation in pay and amenities, we would expect as economists that there's compensating differentials. And so places that have higher wages might have worse amenities because the wages compensate for the worse amenities. In fact, what we find is the opposite, that there is a very strong positive correlation between amenities and pay. So a 10% increase in the factory's average hourly wage fixed effect is associated with an 8% of a standard deviation increase in amenities. So it's a very strong correlation.
Two quick questions.
Yeah.
So those 6 amenities, how much do they move together? And do you have any evidence that workers care certain amenities more than others?
Yeah, so we do have the weighting, and sorry, I realized I think this is the version of the slides I sent for the handout, so I don't have the appendix here. But we are putting different weights on the different amenities. Like they care most about training and opportunities for advancement, so we put the highest weight on that. And the lowest weighted amenity is the maternity benefits, and we put the lowest weight on that in this kind of index that we construct. So there is variation kind of in the amount to which workers care about these different components, and we reflect that in kind of how much weight we put on it when we come up with this overall ranking of factories. And then on the question about what was your first question? Was sorry.
How much they move together?
Yes. How much there's correlations. Yeah, that's actually a great question. I think we haven't looked explicit. There is a lot of these things are all quite positively correlated. So we initially thought it would be really interesting if firms kind of offer different amenities and there's like heterogeneity, like horizontal differentiation among employers. And then at the end of the day, it actually looks much more vertical in the data, that like there's kind of just seems to be a quality gradient. And so many of these amenities tend to be more likely to be offered with each other than yeah, but I can look at that more carefully. Okay. So of course these are imperfect measures. They have probably a lot of measurement error in them. And so we want to try to validate that that they still capture meaningful variation across factories. And so, we're still in the process of doing these validation checks, but what we can see is that the factory level wage fixed effect and amenity measures are significantly, so we can take, that's those are kind of estimated with data that we collected from workers. Then we take the data we collected from the managers and we try to say how correlated the worker reports are with the manager reports. And what's encouraging is that these measures are significantly positively correlated with the manager reported wages and amenities. So a factory that comes out in the vacancy data as being a high paying factory is also a high paying factory according to workers. So this is like a good like phew, you know, we're getting real signal in the data, and the same for amenities. They're also negatively correlated with managers' reported level of turnover at the factory, which is also something we would expect. So better paying factories, better amenities have lower turnover. And they're positively correlated with factory size, which we would also expect that larger, more productive factories would have these higher paying wages and amenities. And kind of in this kind of world of Nansen, we have in mind, like they would strictly need to pay more and offer better amenities in order to be able to grow larger. So that also kind of conceptually fits with the framework that we have in mind. Okay, so that's the sample, that's the how we measure wages and amenities. And now I can actually tell you some of our interesting findings. So first we want to understand, what do workers know about employers in their local labor markets and the wages and amenities in the markets. And so the first fact that we established is that workers have low knowledge of nearby factories. So what we're doing here is taking the list from the MIB of all of the garment factories, you know, up to 10 kilometers from the worker's home. And we know this because we know the location of these neighborhoods, right? We have like the GPS coordinates of the neighborhoods and the GPS coordinates of the factories. And so we can just measure the distance to these factories. And what we did is draw at random a factory from the list. And we asked the workers, have you ever heard of this factory? And so I'm just plotting here the share of workers who knew a factory by name. And then on the right is by worker's sex. So the blue dots are men and the red dots are women. And the x-axis is the distance from their home, the worker's home. And so what you can see is that even at very close distances, women know less than 30% of randomly drawn factories, like within half a kilometer to a kilometer of their home. For men, it's higher. They know about 50% of the randomly drawn factories. But you can see for both men and women, the probability that workers know of a randomly named factory decays rapidly between 0 to 2 kilometers. And it kind of flattens by around 3 kilometers at about 10 to 11% probability that a worker knows the name of a factory. For men, it's about, that's for women. For men, they're always about twice as likely at any given distance to be aware of a factory. So this is kind of striking. We might think it's hard to move around in some of these areas outside Dhaka, so maybe it's a little bit less surprising, but this is like very like localized information, right, about employers. These are current garment workers in this industry. We can also split by whether factories are high or low paying and saying, is there any kind of reputational boost to being a high paying factories? Are workers more likely to know you exist? And that's true. So the blue dots here now are the high paying factories. At very close distances, there's about a 10 percentage point increase in the probability a worker knows a high paying factory, but that decays very quickly over space. And so there's only kind of this very limited range in which there's any reputational benefits of being a high paying factory. Okay, so workers have knowledge of nearby factories. Next, we see that they systematically misperceive their employer's position in the wage and amenity distribution. So what I'm showing here on the left is wages, on the right are amenities, doing it separately by men and women again, but they look similar. And what I'm plotting on the x-axis is the employer's true ranking in the wage distribution on the left here. And then on the y-axis is the worker's perceived ranking of the employer, which we were listed in quintiles. And you can see that for workers who are at low paying factories, they systematically overestimate their factory's position in the wage distribution. They think they're at a higher paying factory than they actually are, which would be consistent with this anchoring model of the world where they perceive their outside wages to be more similar to their current wage than they actually are. If workers' beliefs were accurate, then these lines would be on the 45-degree line. They would exactly line up along the percentile distribution. And then you can see that workers, this is also consistent with anchoring, at the top of the distribution tend to underestimate how good their factory is. So they don't fully realize how high paying their factory is relative to the market, which is all, yeah, as I mentioned, consistent with anchoring. The pattern for amenities looks very similar. So this kind of indicates that workers have biased beliefs about what wages and amenities they could earn were they to search for jobs. And then the final fact I'll show for today is we wanted to kind of show suggestive evidence that these misperceptions actually influence workers' job market behavior. And so here I'm using the control group, the panel of job search and switching that we collected for about 18 months. And what I'm doing is I'm conditioning on a factory's true rank in the distribution and looking at the workers' perceived ranking and the probability that they change jobs. And what you can see is that conditional on the true ranking, workers that perceive their employer to be ranked more negatively are significantly more likely to switch jobs. So this is kind of, keep in mind here that people are they're being over optimistic about their employer on average. And so this is suggesting that that over optimism is actually making them less likely to search. Because if they had kind of perceived that the job was kind of, if they had more accurate beliefs that it was worse than they thought, which is kind of the closer to the truth, then they would be more likely to switch. This is kind of what this is showing. So this is consistent with a world where these types of misperceptions reduce the likelihood of changing jobs, reduce the mobility that workers, which is kind of the mechanism that would reduce the elasticity of labor supply to the employer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the thing is that did you cross-check with the workers who are already low paid and also who are living nearest to the factory? So what I'm trying to say, the workers who doesn't know anything about the nearby factories, whether if he or she is low paid, she will obviously think that what he is getting is enough for him. And the person who doesn't even know that there is any factory nearby, how can he or she judge that what is the perceived wage or benefits for him? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of argument in our paper. So in that world where workers have no information, there's a pure monopsony model where firms can pay, very low wages and amenities because there's no risk of losing their workers to firms that offer better wages and amenities in the market. So that's kind of in kind of theoretical models of monopsony, there's these different mechanisms that can generate monopsony. And like this kind of limited information is one. And you take it all the way to the extreme and then you end up in this kind of one employer, one firm monopsony town because workers don't know about the existence of any other firms. And so the kind of question is that actually, and this is what motivates the experiment, did these beliefs actually contribute to reducing mobility? And does that actually, is the evidence consistent with that putting kind of downward or suppressing wages and amenities? Yeah. Okay, so motivated by these facts, we conducted an experiment where we either provided vacancy information, which I'll show you how we did this, or we provided the scorecard that I mentioned earlier. We did this in a total of 270 experimental neighborhoods, and we split them. We put a third in the vacancies arm, and then otherwise kind of split them evenly, 2 nights, 2 nights, 2 nights in the other conditions. The treatment, at the beginning of the study, we went with actual paper-based materials. And then because we couldn't go back every single month, it was just too expensive, we set up a hotline workers could call to get the information. And there was an operator who could search and access the same information at the hotline. And then we would send workers text message reminders about the hotline and the information prior to each follow-up round. So we would tell them, especially for the vacancies, that we had updated vacancies that they could access. We stratified the randomization by study site and by above, below median number of factories within 5 kilometers, the count of eligible workers nearby, and the baseline beliefs about employers' amenities. And we have very good baseline balance, so I'm not going to show those, but we have very comparable treatment and control groups. This is what the vacancies pamphlet looked like. So each neighborhood had a tailored pamphlet of all of the jobs within 5 kilometers as reported to us by factory management. This is the example for June 2023. And so then what we would do if a factory reported that it had vacancies of a given type to us, we kind of had a summary table at the beginning where we would say this factory has, this many openings in helper, not sure that you guys will know the Bengali here, but then all of the different types of positions, and then kind of this other category at the end, and then we would tell them how far the factory is from their house. And we did that for all of the factories. And then inside the pamphlet, they could go and get these very detailed information about the job, the type of machine that needed to operate. Did it provide an employment letter? What was the skill grade? Was it a temporary or permanent position? What type of wage was it, piece rate or salary? If it was salary based, what was the wage per month? Was there weekly, or what were the weekly working hours, not including overtime? If it was eligible for overtime, what typical off-peak and peak weekly working hours would be? If it had an EAT bonus, attendance bonus, production bonus, and then the qualifications that were required for the job, things like education, experience, if they had a gender qualification, and so on. Okay, and then, so that's the vacancy pamphlet. And you can kind of see this is really unique information that workers are getting about the very specific salary information, and then all of these other aspects of kind of, whether the job comes with an appointment letter, what types of bonuses, what hours look like, et cetera.
And are you giving this information individually?
Yeah, so we give it to, one worker at a time. Because we did this clustered approach, we told them like any members of their family or the community could join. And so we typically had like a little bit of a crowd when we gave out the information but this is why we did the clustered approach, yeah. But it was like explaining it to the participant in the study and going through the information with them.
So should we worry that you may overestimate? So for example, there's a GE effect, right?
Yeah,
Everybody knows that this factory is great and looking for
yeah. So
people. I mean, hey, I'm competing with a lot
congestion
more
effects.
people, right?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So, this is a partial equilibrium experiment. I think it would be super interesting to scale this stuff up and look at GE effects. We ran relative to the size of these markets and the size of the vacancies that employers were posting, we were treating a very small share of the market. And we've done some checks for spillovers across workers within the same firm, because we do have treatment control workers in the same firm. And across neighborhoods, we find no evidence of spillovers. So I think I'd love to do this like at a bigger scale. But this was already sufficiently complicated. But that's a great question. And then this is what the scorecard looked like. So just factory, score for working conditions, score for salary, some information about the location. And then for the really kind of low quality, so below, we were worried that our team might get in trouble if we had really negative information about factories. So we blinded kind of the scores that were below median in that neighborhood. But then if a worker's factory was below, we explained that to workers, or kind of just that the coding system could tell them where the factory, the color coding could tell them how good on the scale of, really bad to really good the factory was. And then if their factory was below median, we told them the score, and the numerator wrote it down for them. And then, of course, we worry about literacy and comprehension, so we included these kind of cartoons of exactly what was going into the different measures. Okay. So in my last 10 minutes, let me tell you some of these results from the experiment. So the first thing we want to check is, we give you all this information. Do you actually update your beliefs? Do you have more accurate beliefs about the wage and amenity distributions in the labor market? And so the way I'm measuring that is just taking the absolute value of the difference between a worker's perception of the employer's quintile in the wage distribution and the employer's actual quintile in the distribution. And when the kind of the average distance between the control workers' perception and the reality of their beliefs about wages, and then those beliefs in the vacancies and scorecard arm. And you can see that there's so the fact that the bars are lower means that there's less of a gap between. So the red is the vacancies on, green is scorecard. In these workers' perception of the employer's position and the true position. So they have more accurate beliefs about the employer's position in the distribution. This is true for both vacancies and scorecard for amenities. And we see a little bit less updating on wages for vacancies, although we can't reject that the coefficient's the same as in the scorecard arm here. Okay, so we see that workers update, they have more accurate beliefs about the wage and amenity distribution. Does that change the actual employment outcomes? So among workers receiving vacancy information, we test whether the information affects mobility. So here I'm reporting the coefficients of a regression of the outcome variables at the top of the column. And then on the right-hand side, we have each of our treatment group variables here interacted with the time period. So months 1 to 11, right after we gave the information, versus months about 17 to 19 after we gave the information. And so just focusing on column 1, you see that, so first, this is in this kind of this year after the intervention was when there was a very high level of unrest in the garment sector around the 2023 minimum wage increase. And the BGMEA actually announced an industry-wide hiring freeze in December 2023. And so it was actually really hard at this time for workers to change jobs. And so you see only 4% of workers changed jobs in the 11 months after our study started. When we went back like several, 16 to 18 months later, mobility was kind of back to where it was at baseline, which is about 8 to 10%. So this was a time of very low mobility in the industry. But even with that, we see that the vacancies intervention increased mobility by about 30%, about 1.3 percentage points relative to that base of 4 percentage point increase. The scorecard, in contrast, do not affect mobility among workers, so there's no increase in mobility in the scorecard group. Okay, we saw for the scorecard, workers updated their beliefs, but that does not translate into increased mobility. Column 2 is just plotting job search, and if you look at the magnitudes of the kind of effect size, you see a similarly sized increase in job search in the vacancies arm. So it seems like workers are both searching more in the vacancies arm and more likely to shift jobs. Now, while they're moving, they're not actually moving any farther away. So the mean commute time is about 18 minutes, and almost all of these people walk to work. And that's not changing with our intervention. So people are reshuffling jobs within the distance they were already walking to work. And again, no changes in job search and commute time in scorecard. So what we want to know, we see workers are now, does that lead to different outcomes for wages and amenities? And so here I'm plotting in this table, I'm reporting the effects on their earnings and in months 1 to 11 and 6 to 19, the differences in earnings between the treatment and the control groups. And just we can just focus on columns 2 and 4 here. I'm using different measures, different ways of measuring earnings to ensure robustness. And we see no effect in the short run in vacancies, which is when we see a lot more people are searching, which kind of makes sense because it takes time and effort to search for jobs. But then in the longer run, after workers are searching, we see that wages are about 7 to 11% higher among the vacancies group. And then while the coefficients are positive, we see no effects, no statistically significant effects on wages for the scorecard arm. Now, in a world where there's compensating differentials, we would then expect that amenities would decrease for the workers who are earning higher wages with their moves. But what we see, so column 6 is a column we would want to focus on. We don't see any effect on amenities. If anything, there's a small coefficient, but this is less than 2% of a standard deviation decline in amenities, which is very small. Column 5 is reporting. So we found that actually giving people information about amenities and wages affected the reports of amenities and wages. And so we ended up getting some more negative reports of wages and amenities at their factories, which is why we focus on in column 6, what we're doing is saying, I'm going to take a factory's baseline score and just, if you move to factory ABC, I'll plug in the score ABC had a baseline. And so then that shuts down any reporting effects because we're fixing the scores to the score at baseline. And so the fact that there's kind of zeros here is consistent with the fact that any gaps we see in kind of self-reported is based on reporting. So here we're putting these pieces together. We see higher wages with reduction in amenities and increased kind of commuting costs. So on the whole, these workers in this vacancy arm are doing better. They're earning more, they're not trading off on amenities, and they don't have to take more time to get to that job, is the package. And that's not the case in the scorecard arm.
So Laura,
Yeah.
previously you said the factories which actually offer higher wages are also offering better amenities. So me moving to a factory with higher wages, I should actually expect a positive amenity bump.
Yeah, so that's a great
Even
point.
this zero, probably your.
So there's a few things. I mean, this comes to this is like a great segue to this slide of like what. So we thought that the mechanism would be the one you just mentioned. Workers move and they go to better factories. They go to higher pay, higher pay factories. The wage gains are concentrated and workers in initially lower paying factories. So we do heterogeneity by the baseline factory, whether it's kind of below the I can't remember, I think we do below median, above median, or but it is the case that the gains, people are more likely to move and the gains are higher paying workers. But it's not only those workers that get gains. People who stay at their original factory also get wage gains. And so this is kind of consistent with one of the mechanisms I just mentioned here briefly before closing, which is that workers are using the information in the vacancy pamphlet about the wages they could earn or what they're qualified to do in the market to secure wage increases at their home firm as well. So they don't necessarily need to change firms to get a wage gain. So there's some firms at least that are willing to renegotiate on some dimension with workers. And that's something we're still exploring the data and figuring out, which could contribute to a result on these if like people are staying in the same firm. But then also we do see that workers who move conditional and move to like the same quality firm, the vacancies workers still earn more than control workers. This gets tricky because the intervention changes the composition of people who move, so it's hard to compare them. But so in other words, it's like even if we go to the same factory, I'm able to acquire a higher wage than you because I have this information potentially. Is kind of the idea. So we're still we don't see that much action. You're totally right on amenities, but big parts of that are because we see wage gains even without moves, and we see that even if you don't move to like a strictly better factory, you still earn more than control movers would if they move to that factory.
That's why I also had a question, but it seems it's reasonable to ask now. And does it then explain the factories not advertising too much about the information that you're actually collecting and providing, because this is giving power to the people?
Yes,
so to speak?
so I mean, one of the kind of key policy implications of this is that if one of the things that job boards and job vacancy postings does is allow workers to learn about their outside option and use that to increase their pay, then the fact that there's that kind of public good aspect of information there's this kind of positive externality that the employer does not benefit from, right? And so that would be kind of consistent with an under provision of that type of information in the market, and which is consistent with the fact we see not as many postings of this type here. Yeah. So I'm going to wrap up because I know we're at time. I just want to say we're still working on the mechanisms of what does the information do. We just kind of previewed some of them, but we think that the main thing that the information is doing is improving the workers' information about their outside options, which either increases their ability to move or to obtain wage gains at their own firm. And so, as I mentioned, the increased search and mobility is driven by workers at initially lower quality factories. They have higher wage gains, but we also see significant wage gains higher up the distribution. Even when workers aren't moving, they may be kind of able to renegotiate or find ways to get higher pay at their own firm. We also see that this changes the composition of movers, but I'll kind of abstract for that for time. So just to wrap up, this project provides the first experimental evidence that limited bias information constrains actual mobility and arguably job quality, which would be consistent with it giving rise to monopsony. So I haven't proved to you that there's monopsony here. Just these facts are consistent with the labor market in which there is monopsony, and they're very hard to rationalize with other models of the labor market. And so what that means is that kind of employers in these local labor markets in Bangladesh are not compensating workers for their full kind of productivity that they provide to the firm, and they're gaining some rents from that employment relationship. And we see that providing this type of information, when you provide it this kind of scorecard that we gave, ex ante, we thought that might be very useful for workers to kind of have that ranking of employers. But it seems like it was like they used the information to update beliefs, but it was really hard for them to use that information to actually change jobs. And so they told us it was useful for discussions with their employer, but it wasn't that useful for actually trying to move to another factory, the way that the very specific information about what types of vacancies and wages of a particular position, et cetera, were useful. Okay. And so we have several policy. This type of project would then have policy implications for job posting platforms. And Antonio just alluded to some of those, mainly that because there's this kind of information benefit to workers of these types of job postings, it would lead to an under provision of such platforms, which don't exist in Bangladesh, and maybe this is part of the reason why. And then it also has implications for pay and amenity transparency policy design. So there's a lot of places in the world that are mandating that pay and amenities need to be disclosed, or there needs to be some transparency. And our kind of projects suggest that the design of these policies will matter a lot for the extent to which they can actually improve workers' ability to negotiate or to obtain higher wages and amenities. And they need to be very detailed, kind of occupation specific, as opposed to these kind of firm level rankings or disclosures. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to chat more after.
Thank you. I think I'll just say one thing before inviting more questions from the table, that just to acknowledge running this kind of experiment. I think this is the type of experiment that I've seen, definitely one of the more complicated ones. Yeah. So kudos to you. I mean, I know the organization that you have worked with, CET and BIGD, and on and off whenever I visited them, they actually mentioned this particular project. So I'm really glad that, and again, you've been through this COVID and unrest. I mean, whoever in this area, I mean, the shock that we face, it's actually, it's really, really noteworthy and praiseworthy to actually kind of being able to pull off such an experiment. So we have just 3-4 minutes. See two hands, but that's fantastic. I'll start with Arfat and move like one after another. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, despite the fact that I'm basically an expert in migration and urban and regional planning.
Okay.
And just so that you don't think that what I'm talking about is anecdotal, you've done a huge survey and random sampling, RCT and all that. So the results that you have got, I'm sure it's very robust. Okay. Now the thing is, what I feel that the conceptual framework, I have some issues with these. First one, workers face high search costs. Okay. Now, are we looking at costs in terms of a holistic view, or is it in monetary terms only? Number one, because Wolpert, Walmsley, Jasta, these behavioral scientists, they said that information is never complete for anyone, either in developing countries or in developed countries. Never ever can you get complete information, because we see now what Trump is doing with all the Epstein files, and defense spending is huge. So no one can counter that. That's at its peak, the best example of monopsony. Okay, that is defense spending. But what happens in this country? So because now we take a lot of things from you. So my question is, does this vary? Are you looking at only government sectors? Because I have done about 800 garments, and in 2006, I did some more a book with Pratima Pal Mojumdar. I don't know if you go through these books. I think you need to go through this engendering the garments industry, UPL, University Press. Okay. My question is, does this cost vary among different levels of workers and among gender? The reason why I'm talking about gender is that culturally, women tend to camouflage the fact that they are being dictated to by their in-laws and their husbands to take work places near their homes so that they can come back home to do the household chores. Okay. Now, another question is that perception. This perception, what you got through your questionnaire, your structured questionnaire, or what you got through your case studies, might not have brought on the level of perception in finding jobs. Because in the garments factories, when we did 800 garments and some in 2006, we found that we had constraint. The choice is not always dependent upon a lot of factors that they have been able to decipher on their own, because their circle, which includes their own family, their interests play a bigger job seeking than our own interests, number one. Because at that time, even now, even recently, there are everyone trying to they take a lump sum of money, just the way they do to international migrants. They do dalals. The garment factories have got dalals. Whether you have looked at it at that aspect, because once I pay a lump sum, I really want to, pay that again in the next 5 years. Okay. Now, that is why I would like to say this low-wage, low-amenity workers may be too pessimistic. If I have decided that this is the job I'm going to do, because my family likes it, and I'm getting out of the house for some time at least, and out of the household chores, I'm pessimistic now. I'm not. I'm going to accept it. Okay. So now the thing is, we extremely subservient to their folk as well as their families, even the greater families, because culturally there is a stigma attached to women who have to work long hours coming back home. And about job posting in the policy framework, you said about job posting. Now, how many of these women would posting? Are we talking about the helpers, or are we talking about the mid-level management, or are we talking about the highest level management? So this is my question to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start by saying thanks to Laura for the comprehensive presentation. I have a few, not questions, some clarification for myself. Yeah. So let me start by saying that from BIDS, we have done a study last year before on the RMG garments workers and their facilities they have. So there we have found that majority of the RMG industries, they have presence of trade unions there. So did you control for the presence of trade union in your modeling? Because if there is active trade union, either in formal terms or informal terms, they might have better information and wages and amenities may be different in that time. So when discussing about the impact or the effect, I'm just wondering whether you take consideration of that one. Second one, I was thinking about is there any regional variation in your data set or not? So you talked about 3 peri-urban areas. So is there in MIB data set, is there any totally urban sites or not? So we could have some cross check on whether the workers in the urban areas have better amenities or informal facilities compared to peri-urban. Second one, you have already touched a little bit in the discussion point, just the role of digital platforms. You talked about that one, saying that in Bangladesh that is not familiar, but I'm just wondering in that topmost level, like HR position, they might have, in that position, there might be some impact on digital platform advertising on their workers' outcomes and information. So you could have some look on that one. And finally, this is a common questions. As an economist, I have to ask that one. Do you address the issue of endogeneity in your model, like higher performing workers, they have better access to informations. So they have already some advantages. So whether you control for that one in your model or not. So overall, I think it's a good experience for us to have you here and to listen from you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me just go further. Kashmir, then Pushaki.
First, thank you so much, Laura, for coming up. Yes, I was actually looking into your paper, both in Econometrica and the one in Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And I was very interested in both these papers because I also work with worker conditions, wage issues, and women workers in manufacturing sector. Like Tamanapu said, we actually had done a BIDS condition survey in Savar, usually in those areas, but we actually covered not only RMG workers, but people who are working RMG workers. And I had the privilege to visit those areas. And when I went to those areas where the workers live, I have seen that there are several factories in the main road. So there's like Deco, Paragon. So some of these factories are RMG, some of them are agro-based industries. And then there is a small, I will not say slums because they're like shanty areas where worker lives, where I actually did my interviews and try to find out what are their living conditions. And I wish I could give you the survey results. Then you can see that majority of them, because they live in those areas and there are trade union offices, so the workers transfer information from one person to another, and then the workers' relatives who are from outside Dhaka, they come and get information of about vacancies within those areas. So I'm asking a question because I actually, read your papers before, and I wanted to know about something that I can, use in my writings is that you have mentioned that my own fieldwork, I have often observed that workers may already understand that workplace risks and their poor working conditions within the workforce, but especially women workers, because they have limited bargaining power and they meet with economic pressure, they still want to work in those places. So, because from your model, I'm just trying to understand how do you distinguish between imperfect information and constrained choices of women, and whether if we can tell the workers to implement message committee or safety committees, things like that, it can actually help worker act on information more actively. Like I'm asking for a solution for my work.
Bhushaki, is there anybody who would ask question, or is Bhushaki? Then we can, you'll be the last. We have only 4 minutes above, but please go ahead. I'm not.
So thank you, Laura. It was very edifying. I enjoyed a lot, so I will be very brief. So I was thinking that did you have the question in your questionnaire that the treatment workers who got the vacancy information, why they really moved to other? So is it due to is the sole factor is that they got the information there, or there are any other factors? In other way around, what are the controlling factors in your regression analysis that you've controlled, as Tamannapu has already asked? Why am I asking this? We have done a study in 2019 just regarding the impact of Accord and Alliance after the Rana Plaza collapse with Dr. Qazi Iqbal and Dr. Mozur Hossain. It's published. So we collected the information before through recalling in 2013 the labor productivity of those factories. We did the survey, and we also collected the labor productivity right after 2019. So what we then found that the treatment who were complying with Accord and Alliance, they have a higher labor productivity in short term, I mean within the 5 years. And then we thought that what is the mechanism? Because it was not an RCT, we just collected the data for treatment versus control. Then we again did a worker survey. So in that, apart from the enterprise survey, we asked the garments workers that what they feel, and the workers who were working in that factory since 2013. So we asked them that, what do you think? What happened? What the change in your work environment that was in 2013 versus 2019? And we inserted that variable into our final factor productivity equation. So my question is that, did you have any kind of question like this in your questionnaire or not? Thank you.
Great. Should I take a few minutes? Yeah, thank you for these fantastic questions. I'll start with the final one first, and then I'll go back to the beginning. So, I mean, I guess from a kind of a causal identification perspective, the fact that we see different mobility and different wage evidence in the vacancies versus control because the intervention was randomly assigned, we know we can attribute that difference due to the treatment, given the fact that our internal validity checks were valid, and so we kind of meet the criteria for that to be true. We didn't ask, but I still think it's an interesting question to directly ask the workers in vacancies, what did you use the information for? How? We asked kind of more structured questions to them about whether they found the vacancy information to be legitimate, to be accurate, to be useful for searching for jobs. And we had 88%, this was like 10 months later, 11 months later than when we gave it to them, originally started, which is helpful, but it's still, there's some social desirability bias potentially affecting these, because we're like, oh, we're giving you this information, and then tell us, is it useful? So, but it was at least comforting that, 90% of workers said they thought it was real vacancies, real information about the vacancies. And so I don't know for sure, exactly how they were using it. And I think we're probably a little bit too late, but it would have been cool to like run focus groups and talk to people and find out more about what exactly they did with the information. And then I guess coming back to the questions that we had over here. So there was a question at the beginning. So I think one of the key themes was gender and women potentially being less able to move or less interested in moving based on having kind of improved information. Ahead of time, we were really hoping to study gender heterogeneity in the response to the treatment. Unfortunately, we had a kind of an implementation error, and there's a bunch of data that kind of were not collected correctly, and so we weren't actually able to bring into the study. And so we don't have sufficient statistical power to detect differences between men and women in terms of the treatment effects. So completely with you that like very much interested in understanding whether men and women responded similarly. We do see that both sexes update, like men and women both update their beliefs similarly. If anything, it looks like men are more able to respond in terms of moving, but both groups are more mobile. So, and both groups have wage gains. So, but we can't reject that they're the same, which is where that being underpowered comes in. So I didn't emphasize that in my comments. But the fact that women do search more and are more likely to move when you give the information suggests that's kind of demonstrative evidence that they are interested in moving, because when you give them better information, then they use it to, at least some of them use it to move. And so I'm sure many women who are very constrained and would be unable because of family and social and many other pressures that constrain their mobility, would not be able to move. But there are a group of women who would move if they had better information, is what our data suggests. Interestingly, in our data, men and women have the same commute time on average, about 17 to 18 minutes, and they're similarly likely to walk to work. So we thought ex ante that men would be commuting farther than the women, but that's actually, and women's commuting very far. People are staying pretty close to home. And actually, like one reason people talk about for that is because they like to go home and eat lunch with their kids. Like a lot of them, if they have kids, it might be one of the only times they see them during the day, and they have an hour lunch break. So, 20 minutes home, 20 minutes eat, 20 minutes back, it's kind of all you can fit. And so that really constrains your choice set, which is, has these potential implications of, you combine that with really long hours and people can't see their kids in the morning or night, then it keeps their choices really limited. And then it's just, the question about, so in terms of which types of workers we included in the sample, we included non-managerial production workers. So we were not focusing on kind of managers or managerial, like that type of level where we thought there could be better information available. We were really focused on kind of workers who may not have access to that type of information. And we did ask in the firm survey, I think it's probably in that figure, one of the categories was like BD jobs, or like I think that was one of the things that we checked in the other BD jobs or other website. Almost no one's advertising on BD jobs in garments for these like worker positions. So there's a category there, but there's just very little mass. That might be, maybe for the reasons we talked about earlier in terms of the information externalities for the low-wage workers. Those types of platforms may not be that appealing, and also on the worker side, it's unclear how much they know or would be able to use it. And then just one last, I guess, I'm happy to talk about many of these offline. I'm sure people are. So let me just say, the presence of trade unions. The reason we didn't emphasize that for a couple of reasons. One is that, there was kind of this issue post Rana Plaza when the labor law was amended, that the way the labor law was amended led to the establishment of many unions, but they often didn't really grow. So there would be unions present, but very small. And so they wouldn't be really materially representing the interests of workers with firms. And then when we did our focus groups and surveys with workers, when we asked them about the types of amenities, including things like labor unions, active worker participation committees, or active worker welfare associations, or active safety committees, those types of institutions didn't come up often when we asked, so we did in our survey measure the presence of the trade unions, but it's not one of the dimensions we included in the index of amenity provision, because it wasn't one of those kind of core amenity families that people consistently said they really, really cared about, which is why we didn't emphasize it. But I think it's super important, and I'd love to see more work on that, so hopefully you can do that. Yeah, thank you happy to talk more about their questions offline. Yeah.
Yeah, I was mentioned this is actually, and especially to you, Lana, because this is the first time you are here. This is a wonderful afternoon, and that's like Professor Byrne, because he brought that she mentioned, he was actually Riaz went to the same meeting. So. Still, you overstay 17 minutes and so a good job. And I just mentioned a couple of things actually. Do not get into your presentation, but just mention that yes, I should have actually welcomed you to be. I just started to look at the beginning of this event. It has a very rich history and actually has who am I to say? We'd really like to have you back here again. If I might just say things work out, I think BADS is nicely placed to get more policy engagement, and as I think we also have a tradition of working in this particular area. I mean, so like many of us actually work. So I think it would be really your experience when you can come back and maybe spend that time here.
Yeah, I love to.
And with that, and getting a lot of busy. It's about 20 minutes almost. And also the organizers for doing this fantastic job putting it together. And yeah, with that note, just bring this event to a close. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep.
I'm so glad you could make it. Because it's a partly good for you.